First, can I say how grateful I am to be invited. I'm Cornish, and ever since Tristan and Isolde, really, Cornish people have been coming to Ireland and wishing that we were more connected with you than with people across the Tamar. If you look at our family history, poor area of Britain, people had to go away to work in much the same way as here. And interestingly, they would go off to mine in Australia or North America or go Patagonia, all over, and perhaps a woman would leave the village, not literate, as it were dead from the point of view of the family, and then the bloke would fall down the mine or go off with someone else, and maybe 3 or 4 years later she would reappear. And then she'd go off again to some other far-flung, never across the Tamar, so into England. So just thank you for having me. Now, before I start, if you look at my title, Lifelong Learning for a World Worth Living In, I think the key issue is whatever I say will be inadequate. Actually, after Nuala, I'm convinced it will be inadequate, since that was a very impressive summary of some of the challenges facing us. So what I want you to do, in order so when I've finished we can properly debate things, is to think, what would you think are 2 or 3 of the key dimensions of creating a lifelong learning for a world worth living in? And then spend no more than a minute on that, and then tell someone sitting next to you and get them to tell you. And then when I do my inadequate little presentation, you'll have lots to argue with me about at the end. But it's also, this is very good theory that, you know, you're much more likely to listen vaguely if you've already decided what the answers are. So if you wouldn't mind spending 1 minute making your own decisions about what the answers here are, and then explain them to, you really need to be in pairs, ideally, to do this. But you can do it in 3s if you're sitting in such a convivial way. Okay? I mean, we might carry on productively for the next 45 minutes, actually, and then I could sit down and say, wasn't that a great presentation? Right. Well, to start then, this is a picture of the of Haiti, Port-au-Prince, after the earthquake in Haiti, and pretty much everybody on the middle of the picture is dead. And it's a reminder that living in a world where there's huge environmental challenges that hit people can disguise that it's not only environmental challenges. Here in Haiti, after, if you imagine the chap standing on the left, he's lost his family, he's lost his home, it's been flattened, and along come helpful international developers who decide the thing to do is to raise the ground and build some glorious new facilities. And of course, along the way, accidentally, he loses his land rights, and the civil administration has collapsed anyway and was never very organised. So what do you do about it? And I thought I'd start with an illustration of adult education for making a social purpose, a change. An organisation wonderfully called Defenders of the Oppressed organised barefoot legal worker training to help people claim their land rights in order not to be steamrollered by a development process for modest individuals against large corporations. It's a stunning programme, and of course it means that Defenders of the Oppressed don't have an uncomplicatedly happy relationship with decision makers. So the start of my lifelong learning for a world worth living in is we have to address pretty serious challenges. This is something similar in the Philippines, where there are every year huge numbers of typhoons and water surges and earthquakes and so on. And this is the digging out of a local community whose religious practices involve worshipping your ancestors, going to the graves of your ancestors and paying respect to them as part of the process. Well, if the ancestors are 20 feet underground and your village has been collapsed here and people are undergrad. What do you do about the challenges in helping a community to move, to rebuild itself, to find a way of holding on to its traditional values at a time of change, dealing with the community that's displaced or slightly uncomfortable by the arrival of the refugees? I mean, it's a global picture, but adult education at the heart of that is surely around making sense of the ethics, values, meanings in your life. And again, that's a photo of organised by a community education programme there. This is in Burkina Faso in West Africa, and they're herders who went to a voluntary adult education organisation called Andar Pintal and said, can you organise education for our sons? We move around, schools are no use to us because they have an assumption of stability that you're going to be in the same place at the same time, and we need our sons to be educated. And of course, Andar Pintal said, well, we could. We're certainly not going to do it unless you also educate your daughters. And so there's a kind of issue about not only just servicing people's real and different needs, but also confronting the issues of rights, I think. So I thought those would be kind of interesting kind of starting illustrations. And then here is a group of who I think are the most inspiring adult educators. They're a feminist literacy collective organisation in India, in Delhi, who called Nirantar. And they go to some of the poorest parts of Uttar Pradesh, where Dalit women, untouchable women, are not only denied the human right to learn to read and write, but any rights of association with other people without permission of the people in the houses they live. And they go and organise and train and teach Dalit women. And you can imagine what a lot of cultural struggle there is involved in that activity. And the Indian government has a law which entitles all women to free access to literacy and numeracy education, but it means nothing if you are denied in practice by the social and cultural mores of where you work. And Nirantar's task is to try to make the law beat upon the pulses of the people, if you like, to bring it to... Now, in each of these areas that I've illustrated, there's adult education as transforming, but centrally involved in a process of struggle of one kind or another. The gap between what we say we believe and what in practice we believe. And I mean, these are from exotic other parts of the world, but I could have shown you illustrations from Bolton and Blackburn and Brighton that would be, of course not from Ireland, that would be just the same. During the run-up to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in September, which shape global priorities for the next 15 years, they described the future we want for everybody as being around equality, sustainability, and human rights. And I mean, I don't really want you to look at all the bump in there, but the idea that inclusive human development, economic development, sustainability and peace and human security are all core features, and that actually to enable any of them there's a learning dimension. You realise that if you're not careful, you construct an idea of lifelong learning which is almost like, I could do a bit of that, I could do a bit of that, I could do a bit of that. And that is one of the problems I've found in my working life around lifelong learning, because the truth is you could. And if you want to make a difference, you do have to, not institutionally, but structurally, involve recognising that learning makes a difference to people being able to sustain or to transform their lives. I took my title from the World Social Forum, who meet, invented in Brazil, 60,000 people meeting for a week, all of whom in tiny groups are inventing different fantasies about how the world could be a better place, from landless people or peasant organisations or French intellectuals who want to introduce the Tobin tax to enable financial transactions to help pay for development and happily weaken the power of the City of London as well. Why I chose it, they have as their headline that another world is possible, and also to think that all the time what we have to do as a key dimension of the work we do in learning is to imagine how things might be different, and then how they currently are, and then to think how you get from one to the other. I mean, the methodology is really Augusto Boal's, but interesting. This is, I'll come back to this in a minute, but this is a march of the World Social Forum, and capturing the idea that learning isn't only something that happens on a wet Wednesday in January, but it's also something to physically celebrate, to take to the streets and to make a fuss of. In 1996, UNESCO created a commission to look at, well, what are the key dimensions of learning to enable the human right to be realised. And it's actually learning the treasure within, but I'm obviously mislearning off that slide, apology. What he argues is that Jacques Delors, who first did something inspiring with the European Union, then moved off and created this wonderful document with a committee, what he argued is there are 4 key pillars for learning and learning society. Learning to know, well, certainly in England, we think that matters in education. Learning to do, which is something you do if you go to further education and so on. Learning to be, well, we're much less good at that, or at becoming. And learning to live together, well, I think that's a challenge for all of us. But you could see that most of the constructions we have about education, as distinct from a lifelong learning society, focus us too much on 1 and 2 and find 3 and 4 there in that list a bit harder, particularly since we began to panic about economic and industrial change. So UNESCO published that in 1996, and at the same time the OECD produced a report of the finance ministers of the richer countries, where they argued that lifelong learning was key to human capital, and since we could no longer use physical capital as the driver for affluence in industrial countries better focus on that. And, I mean, we did see a pretty in a country like Britain, we saw a major increase in investment and interest in lifelong learning after that, but of course also the interest of the finance ministry, the treasury on it, which gradually narrowed and narrowed and narrowed what it thought education was worth doing. So the argument often, if you listen to our politics, is you need learning through life in order to grow, because growth is the route towards reason and happiness. And I've chosen in this slide 2 counter-arguments. One, the wonderful book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, which at the spirit level, where they just show how everybody is more miserable in more unequal societies. That if you look at the societies which have the narrower gap between the affluent and the poor, everybody lives longer, not just the rich. Everybody lives longer. They have less mental health problems. They have lower crime levels, all of it. And it does this study with 50 different countries, but also with the 50 individual states of the United States, and those with the largest gaps between affluence and poverty. The Anglo-Saxon model of economic development have all of the difficulties that come with having a slightly less comfortable being less comfortably at ease with each other in society. It's a powerful book. I mean, it uses, I think, 16 different factors to look at these charts. And what it shows you is GDP really matters up to $10,000 per head. With every dollar you have extra up to that a year, you see improvements in health and mortality and all the rest of it. After 10,000, the things that make a difference are the gap between wealth, the relative gaps between wealth and poverty within your society. The other thing in this slide that I thought was quite amusing is when Sarkozy was president of France, he got very upset that, you probably know all this, but I'm going to say it anyway. He got upset that France kept coming too low down on the international league tables of human development. And the problem of this was related to, in part at least, to what gets measured in gross domestic product, GDP. So he got Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen and the French economist Fitoussi to work together to produce a report, Sarkozy Commission, to argue that GDP wasn't good enough. And it starts off with this wonderful story. If you drive to work safely, this is of no use to GDP at all. Nothing is added. But if you have a crash, it's fantastic. The police are called, so they're busy. Those cones they put around a crash, well, they put the insurance companies involved, the hospital when you go off to have your arm mended, the person who gets a job because you're not able to go to work. So why don't we have crashes every day? Because that would enormously improve GDP. So he said there must be something wrong with GDP, and of course it doesn't capture all of those things which, you know, what Einstein said about not everything that's measurable is worth measuring, and not everything that, well, both sides around anyway, that, you know, you can't measure everything that's really, really valuable. So it's a point. Raymond Williams, the Welsh European, argued that, adult educator, argued that adults turn to learning at times of change to understand what's going on, to make adjustments in the light of it, and to shape change. And that's clearly a rising hierarchy. And the pictures I showed at the beginning are about people not only recognizing what's happening, but looking to shape the changes that they make. And I mean, it does seem to me that at least part of the role of lifelong learning in a society worth living in is focused on securing that everybody has a voice. Brecht's idea, Gandhi's idea that you measure the effectiveness of your society by the effectiveness of its support for the weakest members isn't a bad mechanism for thinking about how well we're doing on this typology. And as an adult educator, my kind of rather more modest take on this was, well, to notice who didn't come, who isn't there, and what we could do about it. So to recognise, you know, it's every form of social service, of course, the same. Working class people, ethnic minorities, disabled adults, older people, young people without qualifications, people who live too far away in rural settings, and also don't have access to the internet, for that matter, and people outside the labour market in England. And there is no doubt that you can see why OECD won the symbolic battle around what we do about lifelong learning in the human capital side winning out over the human rights side, because if you look at all the changes that are going on, the globalization of goods and services mean that jobs that seemed pretty stable and for life are no longer like that. And you've either got people on ever more depressed wages or kind of kings of the global economic super universe who can go anywhere and charge anything. Economic crises, that climate change, demographic change, each of these things throws up an agenda for what you do about it, how do you think through the learning agendas. And they're not quite the same as getting people ready through schooling, the kind of clockwork model of wind somebody up at 5 and they'll carry on for a certain number of years and then that'll do them. Because for most of these things, you need people to be making informed decisions about what to do before we've done a wonderful education for our smalls and they've grown up and sorted us out, really. Community, well, I mean, you can read the list there, I hope. And democratic deficit is perhaps the most important one. But at the same time, I mean, it's not all gloomy. And rising life expectancy throws up new and very positive forms of demand on lifelong learning. Improving living standards means they can pay for it too. The potential that arises from technology, well, you know, it's a mixed blessing, isn't it? Absolutely glorious and a new form of exclusion, both at once often. Better communications and the recognition that growth isn't enough and that well-being matters. Something I think that's really important to notice is you both need good regulation and rules, and they're not enough. So the assumption that global and regional conferences are powerful enough to hold countries and the international community to account has not proved to be valid, is what the Global Monitoring Report on Education for All produced this year. And I thought that wasn't a bad summary of what public policy has been like in my working lifetime affecting adults. We've had some glorious celebrations of the rights of people to learn throughout their lives, of the importance of intergenerational learning and all the rest of it from politicians. Then you look at what actually is there on the ground, and even when they sign up to the agreements in grand halls, it doesn't mean that it'll happen. And that, well, they also make mention in this report that technical solutions, which tend to be what we focus on when we're thinking about a problem like how do we make lifelong learning work for people through their lives. They are important, but they're nothing like as important as the political and cultural buy-in. And so a core point I wanted to make is that lifelong learning for a life worth living involves advocacy. It doesn't only mean doing it, it means making a fuss about it, celebrating it, persuading other people why adults in all of their diversity are worth making a fuss of. Now, I want to go on and say, illustrate from the work. I used to run National Institute of Adult Education in Britain, and we commissioned a £1 million of our own hard-earned savings on a strategy for lifelong learning published in 2009 by Tom Schuller and David Watson, who wrote them up. And they take 4 life stages of post-school education as a way of thinking about. I'm acutely aware I'm not talking about early years, and if you can hear ... in that for the minute, but this focus for the minute is on 18 plus or 16 plus. They show, this is a bizarre chart, what it maps is the transition of young people between 18 and 25 and what happens to them in Glasgow. And you don't have to know, you don't have to look at it in any detail, but yellow is schools, pink is higher education, grey is work, and there are all sorts of bits in between. What you're meant to draw up from it is there isn't the sort of simple pattern of school, college, work that we might think about for young people, that transitions into adult life are more and more complex as time goes by, and that in thinking about lifelong learning dimensions for young adults, you have to not have the kind of, certainly in England, we have extremely rigid cut-off points. You can have this up to 19 and afterwards not. If you've been ill or you've taken a route that took you in another direction, you went away, your life is more chaotic than they imagined. You miss out in the system. And so transitions are complex and systems need to be flexible enough to deal with that. Their second stage is 25 to 50. And they use here a rather nice chart from Oswald in 2007 on people's life satisfaction, which is basically from 15 to 42, life gets more and more miserable, really, with each passing year. But after that, it's a buzz. It gets better and better. there's a certain recognition here of people of 41. Of course, what the chart is meant also to show is there's a time squeeze on people in of course, the point of transition is indicative rather than actual. But between your mid-20s and 50-ish, you've got everything to fit in. You've got jobs, having families, breaking up with people, remaking friendships. You've a complicated life. How can you fit learning into it? Well, usually people's answer to that is, if I can't do it at work, hard luck. So most learning for people in those intermediate years happens in the context of the spare spaces of otherwise extremely busy lives. And then the third stage is almost completely the reverse. You're still functional. Sad people like me go back to work after they've stopped. Civil society absolutely fundamentally depends on the energies of people between 50, 75, keeping all of our social institutions vibrant, whether they're faith-based or civic in their interests. And this chart shows the level of formal and informal volunteering that people do during those years. Of course, it's not neutral. Like all those who isn't there and what can you do about it list that I produced earlier, it's people who've got a degree of economic comfort who most obviously do the formal volunteering. The informal volunteering of, can I do your shopping for you, for the person next door who's got a bad leg, is much more right across the piece. But there's no doubt that we don't take the educational needs of that third age terribly seriously at all. And Tom and David did an analysis of how much was spent in the UK economy on education and training of all sorts, everywhere, in the army, in the health service, in agricultural industries and so on, and in, of course, formal education and training. And you found that although most of the learning going on is between 18 to 25, even more of the money is spent 18 to 25. And by the time you get to 75 plus, almost nothing at all is spent. And yet, making sense of your life, changing to more of a sedentary life as your physical skills diminish or dependency increases, throws up just as many challenges as the earlier years. We have a wonderful project, Learning for the Fourth Age, in Leicester. And in its sister organisation, they found that when they introduced classes and exercises for people in their 80s and 90s and so on in residential care, they saw a 75% drop in the use of incontinence pads in the daytime as a result of people's increased sense of agency and a 50% drop in terms of the pills they would take during the daytime to manage themselves. Now, that's really power in an aging society. That's very powerful evidence of, and yet, of course, one of the things we need for a lifelong learning society worth having is an ability to think across silos, that we're not tidy in learning. Adult learning has really positive impacts on health and on crime, on all sorts of the areas of public policy. But a senior civil servant once said to me that he didn't know another civil servant who'd had a great career out of making a triumph for the minister in another department. That by and large, you work in your silos. And so health will say, we absolutely agree, education makes a difference to health, and so education should pay for it. And education says, no, it's real health benefits. So we end up being paid for by nobody. Well, this report of Schuller and Watson, I thought, provided something of a skeleton for the more practical, technical things we might reasonably do. To think about those four age bases in the way that I suggested, to rebalance resources fairly and sensibly across those stages. To build a set of learning entitlements, I proposed that, if you didn't like school the first time around, how do you get seduced to go back to it? It's a really important issue. That's why I set up Adult Learners Week, really, as a way of celebrating existing learners, making a posh frock day for them in order for other people to say, oh, I could do that too. And I thought too that if on your 40th, 50th, 60th, 70th, 80th birthdays you got a note through from the government which gave you a voucher for free classes to go along, you'd be more likely to think about, well, I wouldn't mind a cruise to do a bit of learning about Scandinavia. Do you know? I mean, it's a frivolous idea, but you can see that more use than getting a telegram from the Queen when you're 100. Or, well, complementary use, if you like. You can't have a system that works for people unless you have more flexibility and credit, and that means those of us who work in institutions being less policeman-like. The quality has to be good. You have to have something of a curriculum for citizens' capabilities. And Marcia Sen is wonderful on this. You need digital competence, capability. You need financial capability. You need the ability to make your voice heard. All of those things. And of course, you need to be able to read and write too. You need to have an idea of the lifelong learning workforce, which isn't only limited to people who get paid for doing it. It's something we all engage in one form or another. And you see that most evidently in family learning activities, I think. And state isn't very good at doing it. That you can make grand statements at the level of the whole country, but by and large, it's more locally that you solve the problem. We had a Secretary of State in England who understood this, called Gillian Shepherd. She was an MP for a small town called Thetford, but the debates were all around learning cities, so she came to Adult Learners Week and said, Alan, I want you to make Thetford a learning city in 3 weeks. And I said, well, I'm sure you do something about the learning bit. It's only 30,000 people. How are we going to make it a city in 3 weeks? So national frameworks, but locally determined choices, and to make the system intelligent. I said you've got to make posh frock days. We went and looked, with the inspiration of a politician, really, to find the oldest learner in England. And this was him, Fred Moore, 108. At the time, actually, there've been older people since, but Fred was, there's an amazing party in the Department for Education with 20 people over 100 there, one from each region, who was the oldest learner, and one who was the most adventurous learner over 100 with curriculum. Anyway, Fred, 108, learning about French and art in a home in New Milton in Hampshire. Lovely man. After the do, at which we made a fuss of him, I got in a taxi to go off to another Adult Learners Week event. And I told the taxi driver about him, and he said, here, doesn't he know yet he's not going to be Picasso? And there was a long pause, and then he said, actually, he's twice as old as me and got twice as much gumption. I think I better do something too. And the point I'm making is that you connect with people and see something possible for yourself which isn't on your agenda. And that too is a pretty key element of a learning society. And the Indian educator Harbans Bowler captured this, where he says adult education, lifelong learning in this context, is two things. It's system and culture. And system is registers and organisational buildings, grand halls like this, the courses we offer, the qualifications we give. But culture is different. Within the adult education culture, adults educate other adults by beating drums for attention, singing folk songs and shouting messages over loudspeakers, putting posters on walls, organising exhibits, organising political and religious functions on street corners or in city parks, and by spreading the message on the radio and TV. Well, I've tried to spend my life thinking that was the job, really. And you do the rest of the job as a sort of punishment to be allowed to do it. And here's an illustration of the power of, well, it's both the power of technology and of motivation. These are 4 Serbian women. And you can see, just looking at them, what their lives are like. They're pretty constrained. They live in a fair degree of poverty. And even though it's probably, you know, an artifact from archaeology, the laptop that's on their knee is enabling them to talk to great-grandchildren in Australia. And of course, it's transformative for their sense of their lives. How can you talk free over Skype to your great-grandchildren? What a stunning experience that was for at least 3 of them. And I leave you to decide who the 4th was. I pretty much finished, but technology and place are in the most interesting tension, I think. That on the one hand, you have physical communities of learning where place is enormously important. If you looked at you all in that 3 minutes at the beginning, the intensity of conversations that being alongside someone with a common interest with you throws up is very powerful to watch. At a distance, of course, you have the chance to construct that with people who don't live. I grew up in a Cornish village. I mean, there weren't very many people interested in quite the same things as me. And what, something like the Parkinson's disease expert patients group globally has been able to do on the web is to guarantee that you go in to see your doctor better informed than she is. The monastic traditions, the learning cities, they throw up very different ideas of how you get to do what you need to do. But I've been trying to argue that at the heart of it all, it's convivial, it's cultural, and it needs to be humane. This was the centre I used to run in the 70s. They decided to close down adult education in the area, so we did an all-night, all-day teach-in for a week. Everybody taught free, 1 hour or whatever, and we got the thing sponsored, a penny an hour, as long as somebody was learning all the time, from Monday morning till Saturday night. And I did an all-night history of rock music, and 88 people came and argued about Led Zeppelin deep into the dawn. And these are the people coming out at the end of it, having had a triumph. The leader of the council saying people don't want to pay for tap dancing on the rates at the beginning of the week, and that he'd been badly advised by the end of the week. Adult education can change things, and I think we shouldn't forget it. But the place was very important to that. And finally, then, what is lifelong learning in a society worth living? This is what a group of London school children said. It's beautiful, fun, awesome and good. And that's me. Thank you very much.